Today, we're joined by Dr. Ilan Strauss, a distinguished economist whose current work explores the economic impacts of artificial intelligence and digital platforms. He currently serves as program director of the AI Disclosures Project at the Social Science Research Council, where he works with our previous guest, Tim O'Reilly. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Kevin. It seems like you're going through the team at the AI Disclosures Project here, getting us to present to you guys one by one. No, it's great to be here. And as an economist, it's been an amazing journey to try to think about what it means to regulate AI, because I approach it from such a different perspective to computer scientists. And so today I want to try to share with you some of my perspective and then see what you think that means for you and your club as computer scientists. So governing AI systems, what does this really mean? So at the AI Disclosures Project, and I don't want to repeat the things which Tim said, but we're concerned not necessarily with the problem of how to reduce risks from AI models, which I think is the starting point for a lot of computer scientists. Our starting point is to say, how do we govern AI markets? Because it's markets as the context in which, us as consumers and even us as producers, developers trying to build apps, trying to build AI products enter, and in which we try to compete, in which we try to provide value to the ecosystem and to users. So fundamentally, we're about creating well-functioning AI markets, and we are thinking about what are the things which shape AI markets, which shape the outcomes in the markets, and those outcomes, as an economist, we call it market structure. And market structure is basically the idea that in a competitive market structure, you have many AI companies competing, and because they're competing, the prices are low, the quality is really high, maybe they're even competing on safety, and maybe they're very transparent in the model's chain of thinking, in what you as the developer might want from the model, or the system, or the product as a whole. Or you can have very concentrated market structures, right, where like a single company, maybe OpenAI, maybe everyone relies on their API, and then they can kind of do what they want, right, in terms of what they disclose to the user and the developer, the price of the product and the quality. So that's what economists call market structure. And so as an economist, our approach to think about what makes outcomes in AI, what's going to determine if this is really beneficial for humanity, just like other technologies. A key thing is thinking about what leads to good market structures, which are healthy, and what leads to bad market structures. And we can, go through some historical examples. If you just think about off the top of your head, like telecoms, like why just a few, companies dominate the US and you got to put up with, T-Mobile or whoever, like why are there just a few companies? How did we get that way? And then you might want to compare it to something like digital markets, where funnily enough, it's pretty different. You're in cyberspace, right? There's ones and zeros. But how did we land up in this world whereby one or two companies dominated every market, right? Like Google dominated Google search and maps. And then Apple and Google dominated mobile, right? And the mobile stores. Amazon kind of dominated delivery and third-party markets online. So what are the things which led these digital markets to become so concentrated in their market structure? And then finally, we can get to AI. And there's probably so many things we could list, right? Which is going to decide the market structure for AI, if it's just one company that wins or many. Clearly, there's already a bunch of things, right? We know it's really expensive to build these models. So you could argue maybe, just a few companies are going to be able to build the models. But we know that there are things which we can shape and which we can have a say in, including as developers, to make the model less concentrated, to make sure that more of us can innovate. So one thing that we are looking at are protocols. And one protocol you may have heard of, there's a bunch of agent protocols out there, A2A. One protocol by Anthropic is called the Model Context Protocol, MCP. And that basically means that, instead of everyone relying on OpenAI's API, if you want to build an AI product, it allows for pretty much any model to speak to, any tool or any database, which signs up to the MCP network, the MCP architecture. So this means you're not locked into a single model like OpenAI. And a protocol, as you know, that is basically a rule of communication, right? It's, the protocol decides the language of communication. And if everyone is speaking the same open protocol, it means that anyone can join the network, right? Just like anyone, if you abide by the protocol rules for email, then anyone can send an email. So one thing we are looking at is to say, hey, how can we shape the AI market from the ground up? And one way to do that is through protocols. And this contrasts a lot with the most common way which we think about like governing AI, which is like, well, how do we make these models safe? And what are the rules that government needs to pass, to like, I don't know, mandate that models are inspected or to mandate that models are tested. All those things I think are necessary. But we want to ingrain the rules of the road into the actual AI system itself. So you build it safe and you build it decentralized and you build it competitive from the bottom up rather than kind of mandated after the fact. So one thing to think about is, there are going to be many factors which decide if the AI market is healthy and competitive and allowing for, all of you guys to innovate. But I'd like us to consider, what are the things that we should help be building today, including what protocols are needed to ensure that these markets can be healthy and competitive. So what should we be building? What should we be contributing to, whether it's Anthropic's model context protocol, whether it's other kinds of protocols, to ensure that these markets can be healthy, to ensure that any of you can build an app instead of having to, rely on one or two kind of gatekeepers. So that's kind of, I'd say, my question for us today. Thanks.
Awesome. And before we get into maybe some questions that aren't necessarily related to the AI Disclosures Project, I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of the research you've been doing on what protocols should be looking like to increase competition. Could you share some of the research going on there?
Sure. We're not necessarily like, our team is a mixture of economists, computer scientists, neuroscientists, and then Tim O'Reilly, who's like a technologist. So we aren't necessarily building the tech ourselves, right? Hopefully that's where all of you come in. But one, thing we've noted is that AI increasingly connects to the internet. It needs the internet. The internet is almost like the AI's brain, right? And especially if these companies are going to make money, then they need to connect back to the internet to, sell traffic or ads or something. And the moment you connect to the internet, you're part of a network, right? And that automatically opens up so much room for protocols. And when we think back to the early internet and the World Wide Web, right? Anyone could innovate. Facebook didn't need anyone's permission to start Facebook.com, right? It didn't need Google Play Store's permission or the App Store because it was built in these protocols. And so in some ways, we're trying to, our role is to understand what are the protocols coming up, what are the impacts, and what are the gaps. So we found, for example, that Anthropic's model context protocol is really making it easier to build AI applications, apps, right? Because it means you don't necessarily get locked into kind of one provider like OpenAI or Anthropic. And it's a lot less expensive because you don't need to build everything from scratch. Instead, in theory, you can build an AI application which is going to help you listen to this video and then come up with a summary. All your AI application needs is to be able to kind of connect with some kind of model, and then it needs to be able to connect to this Riverside app, if that's the name of this application, right? So as long as Riverside makes itself open and the app, and then, you can have access to an LLM, then automatically that is going to create like a more competitive market. So what we see already with Anthropic's model context protocol is that it's leading to more innovation and it's leading to more competition. And it also means that because you're not necessarily just stuck with OpenAI forever or Anthropic for forever, you can easily change models. It also means that they need to offer their products increasingly, at a better quality and a lower price, because they realize that they don't have this kind of competitive advantage that they can just relax and sit on. They actually, they really need to be building applications to compete with everybody else now. So we're finding already that MCP is a powerful protocol for decentralizing the market, for making it healthier, but it's not perfect because it's only as good as all the tools and applications and models that it can connect to. But if an application on the web, let's say like Google Maps or Slack or Riverside, closes off your application from accessing the data there that you want to, apply your model to, then you can't build, right? So a key part of kind of making AI competitive is actually about keeping the internet open and competitive through open APIs, what we call, where APIs are, going to be the common way where you're going to get access to Google Maps or to Riverside or to Slack as a developer, if you want to get access to the tool or the data. So that's a key consideration that we kind of noted there.
You had just started to touch upon this, but as we talk about, for example, open protocols with AI, the kind of adoption and making that concrete is a little bit vague, especially for people who are just getting into the space. So when we try to think of broad adoption of an open protocol for AI, is there, for example, another industry that we can analogate it to make it easier to understand, or some other industry that experts can learn from in order to establish effective protocols for AI?
It's a great question. Well, I mean, there are obviously examples from the era of the internet and the World Wide Web, right? So, for example, and then we can try and think of another industry, because it's a really good point. So, take the internet and the World Wide Web, take email, right? So, because there's an open protocol, if I have Microsoft Outlook or Yahoo, I can still send an email to you with a Gmail client, right? My Gmail can talk to your Yahoo or Outlook, right? As long as they're speaking the same language. And that language is the protocol. So it means that anyone is able to connect to the network. It doesn't matter if you're what your email client is. It doesn't matter if you're running a Mac or an Android computer, right? As long as you're speaking that same language, all the email clients can talk to one another. And then in terms of something analogous to other industries, well, yeah, totally. We can think of, for example, I don't know, I was at the office today and they had a coffee machine and you put a pod in the coffee machine, like a Starbucks pod, and you push the button and then the coffee comes out. But these Starbucks pods, they don't work on an espresso coffee machine or on a different coffee machine, right? They create a lock-in in the standard, which means that there can't be any interoperability. So I can't use my Starbucks pod on my Nespresso machine. So a common way, historically, if you think about it, the history of technology, they've often tried to be these standards, which mean I don't know, I can't read my Amazon Kindle book on a competing e-reader made by Barnes and Noble, So standards to try to lock in and to say that you're either with, Amazon and building for Kindle, or you're building for a competitor, means that the ecosystem gets fragmented, right? And then developers get trapped. So yeah, everywhere we look, there's standards in society which try to trap us in, right?
That makes a lot of sense. So we've touched upon the open protocols part of this question, but something else that is also really interesting to us is building evaluations, having quantifiable metrics for if AI systems are meeting certain targets. And so for me, some of the easiest things to think of are maybe hallucination metrics that maybe use a bunch of linear probes or do some mechanistic interpretability or just look at the raw output of the model. How do you think evaluations as this very new field are going to blossom in the next few years? And how do you think governments are going to start adopting them for AI regulation?
It's a great question. I mean, firstly, I think a lot of these model evaluations are important, but just like you learn about cars, not just from crash testing them before they're released. You also learn about the safety of cars by seeing it drove 10,000 kilometers. How often did it crash, right? Take Tesla, right? Or any car, VW. You often only know if a car is safe by looking at the data once it's been ridden, right? So it's the same thing with evals for AI systems, in that the risk space for an AI model is infinite because these, especially for like very general purpose models. So then the question is, what's the right evals to do? What is the red teaming to do? But the risk space automatically gets narrowed the moment the model hits the road and is used for a specific purpose. That's why it's so important to connect evals, which are often done like pre-deployment, to data on how the model is performing as a system once it's deployed, right? So like OpenAI, for example, when they did that one update to their model several months back, and they were like, oh, whoops, we made a mistake with the update. The model was really sycophantic. It was just agreeing with everything the user was saying, and the users were finding it totally weird. And OpenAI were like, oh, but we tested the model beforehand. It kind of seemed okay. There was some disagreement, but it seemed okay. But it turned out they weren't monitoring the model for sycophancy, for it being overly agreeable with the user while the model was running. So I think that evals should be connected to the live data we're getting from monitoring the model post-deployment. And what are the evals you should be running? What are the monitoring data you should be looking at? Well, why not look to start with at the data that these companies are looking at internally, right? So take like a company like Character AI, right, where you can like interact with these, AI kind of chatbots. They often will look at how long the user spends on the platform, right, and how long the conversations are. And maybe they'll monitor for some risks, like is the user expressing like a health issue or suicidal tendency, Either way, those are the same metrics that, ideally third-party auditors or someone could have access to, even if it was accessed in a confidential manner. But instead of having to start from scratch and decide ourselves, like what are the things we should be testing and looking for, let's start with the things which these companies are looking at themselves once the model is deployed. And just to say, I think this really connects to the idea of protocols too. And there's already a protocol, it's called Open Telemetry, where, as you know, telemetry are the things which allow you to inspect the state of your system. So it's like the logs, what happened, and the traces, all the things which led to various actions in your system. And then also metrics, things which you're tracking. And so open telemetry means that we can actually have a common standard for the data types that we're looking at for our system to assess its health and past behavior and present behavior, and so in this way there is a single standard which like a third-party auditor could just tap into the endpoint and say, hey, I can get access to some of your logs, or some of your traces or some of your metrics. So again, I think we need to be looking at evals and talking about evals not in terms of just the model, but increasingly, as like Sam Altman says, as the system, right? Which includes a deployed system.
Like on this note, I also, cause like right now we know that like with more and more AI integration into the market, like I just recently pulled up a stat that says like there are 76,000 positions that have been eliminated because of like AI displacements inside of our market. So like as from the point of an economist, like which side are you standing? Are we saying like AI involvement inside of these companies is going to like bolster the economy and help more employment in the future, or is it going to like replace most of these unskilled laborers and then like people who are on like the lower ends of the bracket?
That's a great question. And to some extent, you could rephrase the question as being, is this time different? Because if you look at every major wave of technology, take agriculture, as you know, probably the turn of the century, 120 years ago, the majority of people in America worked in agriculture. Then tractors came about, right? And fertilizer. And then the tractors got software. And now less than 1%, I think, of the US population works in agriculture. But the output of agriculture is up, 10,000 fold, at least. And same with the quality of the output. So I guess the idea is that Americans were, other jobs were created because food became cheap and plentiful and prices fell. and profits were created because of how productive agriculture was, and then that kind of freed people up to work in other areas. So the question is, with AI, is it going to be different? So maybe everyone will be freed from a job, but will they have other jobs to work in? And I do think that over time, what we're seeing in society is that there are fewer and fewer jobs relative to people who want to work and relative to expenditure. So I think there is a slight tendency over time that machines take people's jobs. But I do think a lot of it is conditional on what AI market structure emerges. If there's one firm that wins and they get all the profits, then I think that leads to more inequality in society. But I think if many firms are able to emerge in the AI structure, then I think to some extent you can have a more dispersed distribution of profits and wages, and hopefully more firms and more workers can benefit. And now the reason why I think that impacts employment is that ultimately I think that when there's a lot of inequality like you have in America today, I think that just a handful of people basically are spending. You're reliant on a handful of people for all the spending, for all the growth, and effectively then for all the jobs, right? And a lot of those richest people tend to save their money instead of spending it. I believe a strong middle class has been vital for creating employment in America, because the middle class are the ones who go out and spend, and then that in turn creates jobs. So I don't think we can know in advance if AI is going to completely destroy or create jobs. I think a large part is going to be decided by if we have policies and protocols in place such that AI can create a middle class rather than just benefiting a few, coders and a few really rich companies. On the other hand, we do need policies, to, just like America created policies like unemployment insurance to say if you lost your job, you got money, or, So all these kind of innovations, we do need to keep on pushing that. But as an economist, my instinct is not to say that there's going to be a jobs apocalypse. My instinct is to say that new jobs are going to be created, and the prices of many things we consume today, if they fall with AI, it means we're going to have way more money to spend on other things. And as we have more money to spend on other things, that's going to create more jobs.
Yeah, just piggybacking on what you were talking about with unemployment insurance, let's assume that for some reason open protocols and more competition in AI doesn't happen, and that there's a lot of wealth inequality after AI gets more powerful. And so in that type of world, do you think maybe a proposal like a robot tax or a universal basic income might come into play? How do you think those would interact?
It's a great question. I think taxes are already a very important part of society. And having a kind of an income tax was illegal historically in America because it was considered to be theft. And so it had to go to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court had to decide, is it legal for government to steal people's money and to use that money to build roads to benefit everyone, to subsidize education, to have law enforcement, right? And the Supreme Court ruled that income tax at a federal level across America is legal. And so the idea that taxes might be relevant to society is already really radical. But what we've seen happen in America and globally is that taxes, or the tax rate, has continued to fall globally because there's more and more competition for these few really rich companies like Google and stuff to set up their offices. And so every country is trying to attract Google, trying to attract rich people because there's fewer and fewer people and companies holding more and more wealth. So taxes have fallen. So even just simply raising taxes on companies and raising taxes on individuals back to the level at which it was in the 1960s or 70s, that alone will be really, really powerful. As an economist, you usually want to tax things which are bad and have subsidies for things which are good. So you tax cigarettes because you want people to smoke less, let's say. So as an economist, you probably wouldn't have like a robot tax because maybe as an economist, you want more robots if it's going to make things more efficient. Maybe you tax financial market speculation. So instead, as an economist, I would probably suggest instead that you tax wealth or income above a very high level, so maybe only hitting the millionaires or the companies which have, incredibly high profits. So that would be my suggestion. Alternatively, I think it's worth exploring something like a digital ad tax, in digital markets. And you can even have a tax on the trading or the bidding for ad space on the ad exchange online, just like some countries have a financial transaction tax when you buy and sell shares. So I think that is kind of one route I think you could go.
And speaking about those FTTs, financial transaction taxes, I want to maybe pivot towards the question of high frequency trading, and especially how AI and like quant firms have been really just going at it. And so I've been seeing a lot of statistics about how there's a bunch of mini crashes happening every day, or these like AI HFT induced crashes. So I was wondering what you think markets, and what do you think like the stocks will happen, and what will occur in the next few years as AI ramps up?
So I mean, you have seen these like flash crashes. I don't know how frequent they are. One thing to note, as Tim O'Reilly notes, my colleague, is that markets have built-in circuit breakers. So if there's too much volatility in a share price going up and down, let's say, then the market has an automatic mechanism which says like we're going to stop trading. And maybe Tim argues that's something we should even consider for AI markets. If you see a system going off the rails. Well, I think with markets, the idea is really that the more information you have and the more compute, in theory, it should actually make it harder for any kind of one individual to really benefit and exploit the market, because the idea is that if everyone has kind of the same AI models, which are thinking in the same way, which have access to the same data, then surely everyone's just going to have the same ideas and be buying the same stocks. So, maybe no one can like really get an edge, really get an alpha. On the other hand, maybe that also means that everyone's going to start to think the same. And so then that could lead to more of these kind of flash instances, especially if the systems are automated and there's no human in the loop. And I think that's kind of one of the key things we learn from these flash crashes is that the sale and buy triggers, which are automated, and the way that the systems are interacting, there's not necessarily a human in the loop, and there's not necessarily clear internal safeguards, which says at the level of anyone's individual software to say like stop selling or stop buying at a certain level. But just to say that something which makes these flash crashes a lot worse is the fact that companies are forced to sell, and so it leads like this cascading down, because they're often buying and selling shares based on debt, what's considered leverage, so they don't necessarily have the money. And because of that, in order to cover their debt, they're forced to sell when stocks fall below a certain level. And then that triggers everybody else to sell, because as prices fall, all of a sudden they need a post collateral. They need because their debt is no longer good. So removing debt or leverage from the system and preventing there from being excessive debt in financial markets is a key consideration to actually ensuring AI systems can't be that dangerous. But clearly the other part is about saying we need humans in the loop. There can't be automated systems, and there have to be system breakers like there already are, but maybe those system breakers need to, be more nuanced and be more specific for the AI era. How that would work, I haven't really thought about it, but I mean, it's a great question.
Makes a lot of sense. This next question might seem a little bit out of left field, but I was interested in how you would think about maybe more non-traditional question. So I was wondering, right, like as AI becomes more powerful, as it can ingest a lot of data, do you think planned economies become more viable of an idea in the 21st century?
This is a really good question. And there was a very big debate among two economists during the Soviet era when, you had communism in Russia based on central planning. Then you had the American free market system, which is chaotic and everyone's doing their own thing. So some people argue that centrally planned systems now can process information maybe more efficiently than the market, you could argue. Markets are incredible things if you think about it, right? Because it's like, what should be the price of bananas at your grocery shop? Or, it's like, how many bananas to make? These are really complex questions, but it's only because millions of signals are sent to the market, and the market processes these decentralized signals, doesn't know how many bananas to produce and at what price. and each signal is sent by a consumer saying, I want to buy this, right? And a producer saying, oh, I'm prepared to sell bananas at that price because I can have a profit. And the market coordinates all of that. It's incredible. So then the question is, well, can a centralized system do what a decentralized market does? In some respects, centralized systems already do that. If you think about what is Google search, or what is Amazon's marketplace, they have algorithms which are matching buyers to sellers based on things like price and relevancy. Like Google search will match you to the most relevant search results, maybe based on millions of signals. On TikTok, on Instagram, when it's recommending content to you, it's using millions of signals to find the most relevant piece of content, right? And so these algorithms clearly can make very incredible allocations based on processing millions of signals. But at the end of the day, you still are having a market, even if it's being facilitated like within a single company, and the market system fundamentally rests on the idea of private property and free exchange. So the idea that you can have a total communist society, I don't think that can work because fundamentally innovation, competition, what do consumers want to buy, that relies on decentralized property and consumers being able to earn a competitive income in the market. But yeah, AI can definitely help markets and potentially make it more efficient, but it still rests on the idea that there's a decentralized capitalist market in which firms own property and the means of production, and firms seek a profit, and then workers try and go out and work for firms, which is very different from a society which is more centralized, right? Where firms don't decide what to produce, how to produce, what markets to enter, but government says, oh, we want 10 firms producing AI products and 10 firms producing shoes, So I still think capitalism is here to stay, and if anything, if AI makes society more unequal, then it'll potentially, accelerate some of the excesses, the worst bits of capitalism.
Makes a lot of sense. The next bucket of questions we'll like to ask about is surrounding China and their economic model, and specifically how they're nationalizing for artificial intelligence. So we know China is one of the leading refineries for rare earth minerals. They have some of the top talent. They're publishing a lot of research in AI, and they're doing all this stuff. They're basically run by technocrats at the very high level instead of being like a lawyer society like the United States. How do you think the Chinese model, or the economic model that they are employing, this very nationalist, industrialist policy, will play out in the long run when compared to the United States policy right now in AI?
It's a great question. And these questions are definitely keeping me on my toes. I'm very much enjoying the variety of questions. I'm not a China expert. The long run is very difficult to predict. 20 years ago, people said that China would become more and more open as it joined global trade, as it traded with capitalist economies. And that openness would not just be about trade, but it would be about Chinese society and politics. So that's what people predicted happening to China in the long run. But if anything, we kind of see the opposite happening in China. So ironically, even as industry has opened up considerably, if you look at I haven't looked at the data myself that recently, but if you look at changes in ownership in Chinese society, increasingly it's private enterprise rather than state-owned enterprises which are playing a key role in innovation, the Alibabas. So even though China is, as far as I can tell, becoming more and more capitalist and in many respects more and more open, society itself is actually becoming slightly less open, it seems, when you look at freedom of speech and how the political system is organized. And so then the question is there a contradiction in that, in this model between the economics and the politics? What's clear is that there are contradictions in the Chinese system which cannot continue for forever. Because I haven't been to China in the last few years, but even though the economy is innovating incredibly well, there's tons of R&D, right? They're building their own kind of chips now, which can be competitive with some parts of, NVIDIA's graphical processing unit microchips. Other parts of society, the economy as a whole is not doing well. And they have a shrinking population, which is a big deal. They have a housing market that's collapsing, and they have falling housing prices and deflation in the economy as a whole, which means prices are falling. And that's really, really dangerous, because when prices fall, consumers don't want to spend their money, because it means they can buy more tomorrow because their money's worth more rather than spending today. And that's what happened to Japan after it had a housing boom and collapse in the 90s. And everyone thought Japan, 30 years ago, Japan was the big, danger for America. And then Japan's economy kind of really plateaued and its innovation declined. So if anything, I think, number one, we're seeing already that there are contradictions in the Chinese system. And so the politicians are going to have to resolve that. And it's unclear if they're going to be able to, especially because some of those contradictions are the result of policies set in the 60s and 70s, like with China's one-child policy, right? And because of that, China now has a shrinking population, which is potentially a big problem, because it means that wages will rise and productivity has to keep up. Number two, the Chinese model is actually pretty open and has relied a lot on American innovation, just like America's model relies a lot on it being very open to people and ideas from around the world. If you look at a lot of the leading companies in China and the people who work there, a lot of them studied in America or worked for American companies and then went back to China. If you look at Meta's new superintelligence team, okay, and you look at the people on it, many of them are people who were not born in America. Many of them might have been born in India or China. And so just like China might benefit from America's openness, America also benefits from China's openness. Now, a lot of people want to say that America and China are in a race for AI. And there is some sense to that, because AI is going to impact your military capabilities. So I can see why that has national security implications. But on the other hand, it's unclear to me if America and China really are in an AI race, or if it's actually Chinese companies and American companies which are in a competition with each other. And in that respect, competition is going to take place quite differently. It's not just going to be about if government supports, Alibaba, the Chinese government supports Alibaba, or if the American government supports OpenAI. It's actually going to be on the innovative capabilities of these companies and what is their competitive model. Are they going to compete on open source or closed source? How are they going to create their platform? Are they going to have open protocols or closed protocols? How are they going to attract developers? And so, in the long term, who will win in AI, I think, is fundamentally going to be about not just the policies of government and if someone's communist or capitalist, but also what kind of a system of innovation they choose to adopt. Is it, what kind of infrastructure, what kind of protocols? So, the two are definitely going to work together. And I do think it can be dangerous and harmful to see this as a kind of just a national race between America and China. Because in actual fact, I think a lot of the competition is about commercial in nature. So it's about companies competing with each other.
Wait, I'd like to touch upon the point that you brought up where it's like China is very widely split into elites and like the population that doesn't that earns a lot less. Like I personally been back to China in the past like 3 years, and it seems that a lot of the people in like Shanghai, like the lower 50% are severely unemployed, like underpaid. Like, do you think that this is like a result as like with more privatization of companies with like AI helping them and then like keeping the elites afloat while like having like more people not earning enough money at the bottom?
That's interesting. I'm not sure, because I'm not an expert in the particularities of China's economy. I will say, economists rely on these like general laws, and they believe that these laws operate across, any economy, even if maybe they're wrong. So one law was this by this economist called Kuznets, and Kuznets basically said, I hope I'm citing the right law and the right economist, but basically Kuznets said that as economies grow from an agricultural rural society and become more and more capitalist, inequality increases. And then he argued that inequality will naturally decline as governments intervene. But he said inequality, I guess you could do it like that. But I think for some reason his was an upside down curve. But anyway, so inequality basically grows as you become more and more capitalist. Why? Because there's more competition. And with competition, a few companies win out. and those companies become really productive. So so profits grow rapidly. And then companies might stop reinvesting those profits in growth. And maybe instead they keep the profits for a few, of the directors of the company, and so inequality grows. But then Kuznets argued that as capitalism gets even further advanced, inequality should fall. Why? Because governments should intervene, because there's going to be political pressure. And then you have things like taxes. So to some extent you have seen that in China, right? With Xi cracking down on corruption, like flashy expenditures, party politicians who he believes are corrupt and are receiving kickbacks. So you could argue that maybe Kuznets' curve is going to kick into gear in China. A lot depends on the social welfare and tax policies, right, of China at the state level, but also at the regional level, right, which I'm not too familiar with. But clearly, capitalism naturally will tend towards inequality because, increasingly we see just a few companies are able to compete in, these really high-profile industries. And so that means profits go to just a few of the companies, and they have a huge say in, what happens to these profits unless government taxes them. So as capitalism advances, inequality definitely grows, and that's what we're seeing in China.
Just speaking more about capitalism, growth, and inequality, I want to conclude this AMA talking about degrowth, because I've seen some of your tweets about your critiques of degrowth and why such policies might not be feasible. So for the audience, degrowth is a branch or a thought of economics in which we should not pursue endless economic growth, but instead we should prioritize other social goods and we should downsize our economy. And so if it is true that inequality will always rise as capitalism expands, what other remedies besides degrowth should we approach, or is degrowth even an idea we should consider?
It's a great question. If you look at the work by Branko Milanovic, who's at the Stone Center for Inequality at CUNY, the City University of New York, he basically shows why degrowth doesn't make sense, because to bring everyone in the world up to the Western or American standard of living, you would still need a lot of GDP growth, a lot of economic growth. And that's assuming that your population is not growing. But we know that even though the population might be shrinking in China, and maybe shrinking in the US if you remove net immigration, the population, and it's shrinking in Europe, it's growing in South Asia, right? Or the Asia Pacific, it's growing in Africa. So we need more economic growth just for this increasing population. So how do we ensure that everyone has a good standard of living? And how do you protect the environment? These are real questions. But clearly, historically, one way in which we managed to ensure that everyone had a good standard of living, if you look at the work of Piketty's, and he identifies a few key interventions, one was taxation. So if you have higher taxation, you aren't necessarily, and especially if those higher tax levels are not just in America or Europe, but they're global. So they're applicable to everyone. So companies can't just relocate. Higher taxes meant that companies still owned the property, right? Companies innovated. Companies competed for profits, and they were still encouraged to innovate and encouraged to compete. But, so you weren't killing the goose, but you were just taxing some of the eggs which each of those gooses were laying and redistributing them in public goods which could benefit everyone. That means high quality infrastructure for everyone, schools, education and healthcare, roads, parks. So in that way, you ensure that everyone can get benefits from the innovative capacities of a few very powerful and wealthy companies. But again, as kind of inequality has grown, it's become harder and harder to tax companies, and instead countries have all lowered their taxes. The second thing which has had really big impact historically on inequality and ensured everyone benefited from capitalism was rising minimum wage laws, which said that everyone has to get paid a certain hourly wage or monthly wage. And that's become tricky as more and more of the economy has shifted to service work, like restaurants, let's say, and more of the economy, you could argue, working in gig jobs, right? Like working in jobs which don't necessarily fit a traditional definition of employment, like if you're an Uber delivery driver. So clearly labor law, tax law, healthcare systems and education needs to keep up with the changing nature of work, which is to a large extent due to not just the rise of services, but also because of the digital economy, right? How we work is increasingly shaped by the digital economy in advanced countries. So I do think we can draw on policies which have worked historically, like taxes, like minimum wages, but we need to adapt them for the era of AI, where there's more digital work and where there's more global competition. And for me, that highlights, coming back to the China-America question, it highlights the importance of not every country for themselves, but all the countries working together. Because unless you have global cooperation on how to, for example, tax the enormous benefits from AI, then instead no country will potentially be that successful. Because then maybe OpenAI will just move its headquarters to Ireland, to escape taxes. So we really need increasingly global solutions and globally agreed ideas to deal with some of these issues. And that's why the OECD agreed on a global minimum tax recently, but then America withdrew from that. So even though each individual country should try their best to fairly redistribute the fruits of innovation, the fruits of AI, chances are countries are going to have to work together to ensure that we can update these laws like taxes for the global era.
As we near the end of this AMA, we just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to come out. We wanted to end on one final question that we hope can spark some optimism within the Hack Club community. I guess as so many of us want to explore a career in AI, we want to help build this and create positive solutions and impacts in our world. I guess one of the major questions that many of us are asking is just, where do you see AI within the next 20, 25 years? And what do you think it can serve as a positive impact in our world?
Where do I see AI? I think the future really, as corny as it is, it's waiting to be written, and as society gets more unequal and more precarious, it lands up being every person for themselves, and every person needs that high-paying job, right, for healthcare, for education, and because of how precarious our lives are with immigration, with anything. And if that is the status quo, then it means we're all going to go work for, a finance company or a big AI model developer. And then it means that things might continue along the path in which they're currently growing, right? Which is a few companies capturing most of the gains from innovation for themselves. But if instead, people decide that they want to build something new, they want to build a more open, decentralized network in which no one person can control the network, if people want to work to ensure that Google, Amazon, Microsoft can not just buy innovation and buy a new company every single day, which is what they do. They buy, on average, 1, 2, 3 new companies a day and squash competition and squash innovation. So I think it's really about if people stand up and say, what kind of future do I want? And am I prepared to work for, a lower wage, but innovate and create some kind of better future? So it depends on what, everyone on this call is prepared to do. And prepare to sacrifice. And I see enormous benefits from AI to society because it can free us to do so, much more engaging work potentially, right? So much more creative work, work which we each find interesting and which we find fulfilling. But for that to happen, it requires for some of the things that we've discussed on this call to take place. In which we all have to work towards. Nothing's automatic. There's no one invisible hand. There's no one market saying that this is always the outcome. Economists find that in all their research, actually, there are always many equilibria or many outcomes. Even if, in your undergrad, you solve for demand and supply and it's one outcome. No, there's never one outcome. And it's about what kind of market outcome we want to, push towards.
Thank you, Dr. Ilan Strauss. It's not every day we get to talk about so many topics with a distinguished economist like yourself. And I hope this AMA has been insightful for everyone listening. To learn more about Hack Club, check it out at hackclub.com.